Hi, welcome back to this reading series. I hope you're doing well and that you've had a good week. You might remember last week I mentioned a book called Captive Genders by Eric A. Stanley and Nat Smith because it was part of No Name's book club picks for the month of July. I've actually decided to read an extract from this book today because I think it follows on really well from Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, which we read a couple of weeks ago. So this book is essentially an anthology of essays and writings which present an analysis of the prison industrial complex whilst taking into account the violence that it perpetrates against queer and trans communities. Um, so personally, this is the first thing I've read that explains so clearly and in such detail how queer slash trans liberation and prison abolition intersect. Um, Obviously, though, this is not a new idea. In fact, S. Lambour, the author whose article I'm about to read from, writes, because prisons, police, immigration officials, and psychiatric institutions have long punished people for transgressing sexual and gender norms, queer and trans people have a long tradition of resistance to institutions of punishment. Building on previous organising histories as well as contemporary struggles, this article argues for a renewed queer slash trans anti prison politics. So the article is called Transforming Carceral Logics 10 Reasons to Dismantle the Prison Industrial Complex Through Queer slash Trans Analysis and Action. For the sake of time, I won't be reading all 10, but I definitely recommend doing so. This article specifically is available online for free, so yeah, definitely check it out. Let's get started. Number 1. Queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people have been historically subject to oppressive laws, gender policing, and criminal punishment, a legacy that continues today despite ongoing legal reforms. Law enforcement officials, including police, courts, immigration officers, prison guards, and other state agents, have a long history of targeting, punishing, and criminalising sexual dissidents and gender non-conforming people. While many overtly homophobic and transphobic laws have been recently overturned in Canada, the United States, and Britain, the criminalisation and punishment of queer and trans people extends well beyond formal legislation. State officials enable or participate in violence against queer, trans, and gender non-conforming communities by A. ignoring everyday violence against queer and trans people, B. selectively enforcing laws and policies in transphobic and homophobic ways, C. using discretion to over-police and enact harsher penalties against queer and trans people, and D. engaging in acts of violence, harassment, sexual assault, and discrimination against queer and trans people. While some police departments are increasingly putting on a gay-positive public face, the problem of state violence against queer and trans people nonetheless persists and has been well documented by numerous police and prison monitoring groups. This ongoing legacy of violence should make queer and trans people both cautious of the state's power to criminalise our lives and wary of the state's claim to protect us from harm. Although some people believe that we can train transphobia out of law enforcement agents or eliminate homophobic discrimination by hiring more LGBT prison guards, police, and immigration officials, such perspectives wrongly assume that discrimination is a flaw in the system rather than intrinsic to the system itself. Efforts to make prison and police institutions more gay-friendly perpetuate the myth that such systems are in place to protect us. But as the uneven history of criminalisation trends in Canada, the United States, and Britain so clearly demonstrate, that is, the way that the system targets some people and not others, the prison industrial complex is less about protecting the public from violence and more about controlling, labelling, disciplining, and in some cases killing particular groups of people, especially those who potentially disrupt the social, economic, and political status quo. While the state might stop harassing, assaulting, and criminalising some people within queer and trans communities, namely those upwardly mobile, racially privileged, and property-owning folks, the criminal system will continue to target those within our communities who are deemed economically unproductive, politically threatening, or socially undesirable. As people who have historically been and continue to be targeted by this unjust system, queer, trans, and gender non-conforming communities must move away from efforts to make the prison industrial complex more LGBT friendly and instead fight the underlying logic of the system itself. Queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people, particularly those from low-income backgrounds and communities of colour, are directly targeted by criminalisation, punishment, and imprisonment. We do not know exactly how many queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people are currently incarcerated. This is partly because most governments do not collect information on the sexual and gender identity of prisoners, and partly because prisoners are not always safe to disclose their gender or sexual identities. However, we know that queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people in Canada, the United States, and Britain are frequently over-policed, over-criminalised, and over-represented in the prison system. Levels of harassment, targeting, and arrest are high, particularly for young queer and trans people, those from low-income communities, people with learning disabilities and mental health issues, and people of colour. Trans community organisers in the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, report that nearly half of the 20,000 transgender people in the region have been in prison or jail. Queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people are funneled into the criminal system for many reasons, but primarily due to systematic oppression. Because trans, queer, and gender variant people experience widespread discrimination, harassment, and violence, we are at greater risk of social and economic marginalisation. This translates into higher risks of imprisonment. We know that queer and trans youth, for example, are more likely to be homeless, unemployed, bullied at school, harassed on the street, estranged from family, and targeted by sexual violence, factors that greatly increase the risks of criminalisation and imprisonment, especially for queer and trans people of colour. Trans people in particular, and those who are visibly gender non-conforming, are routinely harassed by law enforcement and security officials for undertaking basic daily activities like using the toilet, accessing public services, or walking down the street. Groups like Fierce have shown how the school-to-prison pipeline disproportionately affects queer and trans youth. Whether dropping out of school because of severe harassment and discrimination, feeling alienated from education curriculum, experiencing suicidal thoughts, or turning to criminalised coping mechanisms like drug and alcohol use, queer and trans youth often have less chances for success in school. Zero-tolerance policies, heightened surveillance, and increased police presence in schools further contribute to criminalisation and dropout rates, particularly for queer and trans youth of colour. Quality of life ordinances, such as antisocial behaviour orders and Safe Street Acts, are also routinely used to remove queer and trans youth from public spaces and criminalise their social activities. Coupled with problems at home, many queer and trans youth find themselves homeless and unemployed. Once on the street, queer and trans youth have trouble accessing services and support to get their basic needs met. Many homeless shelters and social services, for example, are not safe places for trans people, sometimes banning trans people outright. And problems with gender categories on identity documents can restrict welfare access. Without income, housing, family, or community support, survival often means working in criminalised economies like drug and sex trade. Queer, trans, and gender non-conforming youth who are bullied, harassed, and assaulted, particularly those who don't fit the stereotype of the passive, innocent white victim, are blamed and punished when they defend themselves. The recent case of the New Jersey 7, in which 7 young African-American lesbians were criminalised for defending themselves against sexist and homophobic harassment, provides a case in point. Given that criminalisation and imprisonment both arise from and further exacerbate experiences of social marginalisation and oppression, efforts to address queer and trans homelessness, unemployment, suicide, school dropout rates, harassment, and abuse cannot stop short of prison issues. Prisons reinforce dominant relations of power, especially racism, classism, ableism, and colonial oppression. The modern prison grew out of and continues to be deeply embedded within the European colonial project and the legacy of slavery. This history, which includes medical experimentation, forced psychiatric treatment, sterilization, and eugenics, continues to shape the contemporary prison system today. Whether we consider who is most targeted by prisons or the socio-economic power relations that sustain imprisonment, the prison industrial complex remains a fundamentally racist, classist, and ableist institution. The statistics on who is in prison make these realities painfully clear. In Britain, for example, although people of colour made up less than 9% of the general population, they comprised 27% of prisoners in 2008. Black people in particular are 7 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched by police, and far more likely to receive a custodial sentence if convicted of a crime. In 2002, there were more African Caribbean entrants to prison, over 11,500, than there were to UK universities, around 8,000. In Canada, Aboriginal women make up less than 2% of the general population, but comprise 32% of women held in federal prison, and are more likely to be classified as dangerous offenders than non-Aboriginals. In the United States, 1 in every 9 African American men between the ages of 20 and 34 is now behind bars. The vast majority of prisoners come from poor economic backgrounds, and people with mental health issues and learning disabilities are locked up at disproportionate rates. While corporate media attempt to justify these differential rates with claims that some people are more criminal, the reality is that some people are more criminalized. For example, though black people use drugs at similar, if not lower rates than white people, they are up to 10 times more likely to be admitted to prison for drug offences than white people. Governments, politicians, and corporate media continually reinvent images of prisoners as violent, pathological, and morally depraved people. But the vast majority are imprisoned for crimes related to poverty, social exclusion, and systematic oppression. Indeed, communities that are most criminalized tend also to be most victimized. For example, in 2003, the Canadian Human Rights Commission found that 80% of all federally sentenced women were survivors of physical and/or sexual violence, and for Aboriginal women, the rate increased to 90%. Drawing attention to these underlying factors is not to deny the harms that people in prison may have committed, but rather to put those acts in their social, economic, political, and colonial context. When we recognize crime as symptomatic of broader social injustices rather than as individual bad choices, we are better able to devise strategies that address root causes and actually reduce harm and violence. Queer and transgender communities are not immune from the oppressive logic of imprisonment. Not only do many of us internalize the racist, classist, ableist, and punitive norms of the prison system, but we also create our own kinds of oppressive cages when we uphold social barriers that exclude, marginalize, and stigmatize people in our communities. For this reason, it is important to prioritize, support, and take action in struggles against institutions such as prison, where such oppression is most rampant. Just as struggles against gender and sexuality-based oppression are distorted and incomplete without race, class, and disability analysis, struggles for social justice are incomplete without attention to the violence of cages. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that and that you learnt something from it. Again, I'd really recommend reading the entire article. It's so informative and really accessible. Yeah, that's all. I'll catch you next time. Bye.